Well, ladies and gentlemen, dear friends, I think it is time to start. We don't have enough time to save the world, so we just do a little bit of saving the world during the next 90 minutes. And I'm very pleased and very proud that I'm able to present this at this conference here. I must say, the organizers of this conference have done a fantastic job. The first 2 days were wonderful. We learned a lot. But it's also a lot of work, so that we have to focus on some of the actions we want to take, some of the concrete decisions we have to take. And I think today is a meeting which will try to be very concrete and very specific and very action-oriented. Because, as you know, I'm Peter Eigen. I'm the founder of Transparency International. And during these 32 years of working with Transparency International, we have learned quite a bit about how to strengthen governance in the world, how to address corruption, how to try to improve the lives of many, many people who are the victims of corruption, of grand corruption, all the way to petty corruption. And I know many of you here have joined us in this process, and I'm very, very pleased to organize this conversation with you about one particular aspect which became for us a very successful feature of our work, and that's what we call multi-stakeholder approaches to building consensus for governance improvement. We have seen many decisions to fight corruption. We have seen many decisions to change the laws, change policies, but very often they are not actually properly implemented because the people behind it don't really totally believe in it. So what we are here trying to do right now is to build a consensus between different stakeholders who confess their own interests, their own perspective of how they want to see good governance, for good politics, for a good economic development, for good cultural, social development, and therefore I'm very happy to focus on this, which has become more or less a mantra for for many of us who have worked during the last 30 years with Transparency International, but also with other organizations. And that particular feature, of course, is the multi-stakeholder approach. And by that we don't merely mean that governments invite citizens to participate and advise them and tell them what they really need in terms of an enabling environment for a good economic development, but we really mean a very specific structure and a particular purpose of bringing stakeholders together who confessed to their interests and present their interests and measure the possibility of realizing these interests and their plans and purposes, and find compromises with others who are invited to present their interests and their perspectives. So this is what we want to talk about today when we talk about multi-stakeholder approaches. And I must say, in working with Transparency International, which is the organization which by now is represented in many countries with our national chapters all over the world, with a very strong secretariat in Berlin and in Brussels, and some expert groups in various other centers. We made this experience that whenever we managed to get together these multi-stakeholder groups to discuss with each other and to confront each other and make compromises and come to a common consensus to advise the decision makers. In a democracy, the decision makers, of course, are representatives of representative democracy, elected people, but advise them and say, this is what we suggest you do, then we were able to make progress. And of course, one of the most outstanding examples in this area was at the very beginning when the OECD at one point in 1994, 1995, began to develop a convention against foreign bribery and try to bring together a consensus, in particular in the OECD community of the developed countries and the business community and so on. We found a possibility of getting involved. And we saw that some of the important countries, including my own in Germany, but also the French and the British and the Japanese and many countries, with the exception of the United States, which had already, under Jimmy Carter, developed the Foreign Corrupt Practices Act in 1977 and 1978. But all of these countries felt in the international marketplace there was no authority which would stop corruption. Therefore, corruption was an unpleasant and destructive element of the international community, of the international market, but it was something one couldn't do anything about. And so when we started our involvement in the discussions in Paris with the OECD, they felt it was quite offensive that we were trying to bring about a global rule against foreign bribery. And I must say the fight was not easy, but it was overcome, in my opinion, by this multi-stakeholder approach, which we didn't call it that in the beginning. But it was an attempt to bring together, for instance, in the case of Germany, bring together business. It was Siemens, some of the Siemens people are here, ABB, other companies like Bosch, big German companies, Lufthansa, all people who felt that unfortunately one has to bribe if you do business outside Germany, and the government, which tolerated it and to some extent even subsidized and supported it, the international bribery. They were there and met with us, a small group of people, called us romantics or called us illusionary and unprofessional, and we presented our case that corruption was absolutely destructive, and therefore, under the chairmanship of Richard von Weizsäcker, who chaired the first meeting, we had a real problem in the discussion. But we overcame it because we developed ideas so that in the third meeting we had at the Aspen Institute in Berlin on the Wannsee, we developed this idea of integrity pacts, which is a pact of everybody to stop bribing simultaneously in a very concrete competitive situation, say a World Bank procurement system for a huge project, or in some other similar concrete competitive situation. And when we offered that, suddenly the companies were interested to listen to us. And in the third meeting, basically at the beginning of 1997, there was an open letter sent by the group of business people who were with us at the Aspen Institute to the German government and said, please join the OECD Convention Against Foreign Bribery. And that was probably the most important example on how this multi-stakeholder approach, where each of the three parties, the companies, the government, civil society, presented their interests and in a respectful and open way discussed and reached conclusions in a rather democratic way. In fact, Habermas, the German philosopher, would call this deliberative democracy. And he says it's nice to have elections, you need elections, it's nice to have checks and balances in a democratic society, but you also need a discourse, you need discussion. And this is why we call this deliberative democracy, what we succeeded in doing. And this public letter in the summer of 1997 to the government was the resulted basically in the Germans signing the OECD Convention, which entered into force in 1999. So I could mention some other examples of this kind of multi-stakeholder approach, but we are very fortunate to have here a group of speakers who are representatives of organizations with a very strong multi-stakeholder toolkit, and they will bring examples from their particular activities. And of course, later we will have a chance to also find out from you which examples you have, and whether you think we should further develop this as a mainstream instrument of fighting corruption, a mainstream instrument of fighting the misuse of power and so on, which has been so devastating everywhere in the world. So this is basically what we intend to do with this session here. And I must say I'm very pleased to introduce first Huguette Labelle, who's sitting to my left. Huguette was a very prominent figure in the Canadian development community. She supported me when I started the creation of Transparency International, and later she even joined us and became the chair of Transparency International in Berlin. And I hope that all of you, including Huguette at the beginning, will just give us a very brief description of what you're doing now, and also why this multi-stakeholder approach was important in the activities which you were responsible for. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Good morning, everyone. It's great to see so many of you and faces and people that I have known for a long time. Thank you for being here. I just wanted to comment about Transparency International and leave all the other things that I'm doing aside for this session, and add to what Peter has said about Transparency International, because I'm going to use an example of what Transparency International has done, Integrity Pacts, when we come back with the second round, to give some examples of how this has been important and made a difference in a number of countries and regions, the EU as being one example. Just to add briefly about Transparency International to what Peter has said, it is, of course, its prime purpose is fighting corruption and trying to end this devastating impact that it has on people around the world. TI is in over 100 countries with its chapters, and of course it works nationally, regionally, internationally. It works with several partners around the world, and with major institutions like the OECD, the UN, the World Bank, IMF, and so many more. The regional banks as well, of course. So basically, it has used this important way of working with others, indeed, to make a difference. And it is evolving dramatically. And of course, François Valérian, who is with us this morning, could say a lot more. But I will want to keep the time for our content in terms of what we want to deal with this morning in terms of integrity pacts, in my case, and others, of course, will deal with some other sessions, some other examples of multi-stakeholder approaches.
Well, thank you very much. I would like to then introduce Gea Alexandra Ordenes, because she works for an organization which is structured along the lines of the principle of multi-stakeholder cooperation. And that is the Extractive Industry Transparency Initiative. She's the director there, and I would like to hear how you are developing with a system where basically business, government, and civil society have equal voting power in the decisions of the organization, and bring together about 52 or so resource-rich countries with about 60 or so huge companies, oil companies and mining companies all over the world, and about 400, 500 civil society organizations brought together under Publish What You Pay coalition. And Gay only arrived this morning, so I really don't know what she's going to tell you, but I hope she will point out to you how important the multi-stakeholder approach is to her work.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. And I'm very happy to be here and great to see there's a lot of interest on this topic. So I work for the Extractive Industries Transparency Initiative, as Peter mentioned. We call it EITI. So EITI is a global standard for the management of the mining, oil, and gas sector. So right now we have 56 countries implementing this global standard in all regions across the world. So this initiative is being run by a multi-stakeholder group, as Peter mentioned. It's composed of representatives from government, civil society, and companies, the extractive companies. And that type of governance, a multi-stakeholder approach to governance, happens at the international level and also at the national level. So all the 56 countries implementing EITI, they all have their own multi-stakeholder groups. And as well, we have an international board with the same composition. So we have seen a lot of good practices out of multi-stakeholder approaches to governance from EITI, and I'm happy to elaborate on that later on. But for now, I think what I would want to highlight really is that this is a consensus-building process, which has been very effective in getting different constituencies to understand issues about natural resources, about the extractive sector in a common way. Because, you know, the extractive sector is very corruption-prone. It's a very corruption-prone sector, also very conflict-prone sector. So the need for different constituencies to come together to one table and have a common understanding of how to govern better these natural resources is really very important. So the MSG at the national level, they meet regularly, primarily, well, first of all, to make sure that the level of transparency of all the information in the mining, oil, and gas sector meets the EITI standard. But more than the transparency component of the initiative that the MSG oversees, what's even more important is that this multi-stakeholder group at national levels, they also collectively formulate policies and recommendations in order to improve the governance of the extractive sector. So I'll stop here, but I'm happy to elaborate on that later.
Well, thank you very, very much, Kay. And I think EITI is doing very, very well and is moving incrementally forward to bring a lot of transparency into this very vulnerable sector for corruption. I'm very pleased to then introduce Christian Portman, former colleague from the World Bank. In fact, you were vice president of the World Bank, and he created COST, which is an organization which, through multi-stakeholder approaches, improves procurement everywhere in the world. So, Crick, you are on the line.
Thank you, Peter. I didn't invent COST, but it's very kind you say that. But we've been associated. It's been a long road, but we are currently having an initiative, I think, that draws very heavily on multi-stakeholder approach. So that's why it might be of interest to the discussion today. COST, as it is called, which is the Infrastructure Transparency Initiative, promotes the greater transparency, participation and accountability in public infrastructure investments using a collective type of approach. And that transparency is achieved by publishing data at each stage of the infrastructure project cycle based on what we call the Open Contracting for Infrastructure Data Standard, which was developed jointly with our partners in the Open Contracting Partnership. COST currently has 20 members and affiliates, whereby national and increasingly subnational governments commit to publishing data on their websites, on their infrastructure investments, and to work with civil society and the private sector as part of this multi-stakeholder group, as we call it. COST was initiated in 2008 as a pilot of the former Department for International Development in the UK, and due very much to the success of the EITI multi-stakeholder approach. However, the participants in this multi-stakeholder group, which exists at the country level as well as at the board level, are quite different, are from different institutions, given the very different government procuring entities responsible for infrastructure and the rates and the range of professions and trades in the construction sector. The participation of civil society organizations in the multi-stakeholder group has been particularly critical in enhancing social accountability. It developed in developing locally led approaches to civic engagement, holding community meetings to give voice and space to raise issues about local infrastructure, and very importantly, training the community groups to monitor progress of infrastructure projects on the ground. COST has one particular feature which we call the assurance process, which is a process by which, in the case of a particularly important project, either in size or location, a more in-depth technical analysis is being done and put in a report in a terminology that is understandable to everybody. And these reports are being unveiled in a very public manner, where everybody is present. And frequently these reports are not only pointing in the direction of policy reform, but also put significant pressure, particularly on the government, to adhere to these issues and make sure that changes are made. Maybe 2 points about the multi-stakeholder grouping. In the case of cost, the multi-stakeholder group has created a model which is quite different from the regular and normal confrontational manner in which government, private sector and civil society have been working or not working in the context of public investment. This confrontational arrangement has been changed frequently in one where all parties understand there is a win-win-win situation and it is not a zero-sum game, and that all parties can have very significant benefits and enhanced benefits from collaborating with each other in this type of environment. There is confidence and trust, there's a shared understanding of the data, and there is very inclusive decision-making. The consensus approach that you mentioned is equally put in place in cost. I'll leave it at that.
Well, thank you very much, Craig. I knew it was an exciting venture in which you were, and I always associated with you, so I'm sorry that I upgraded you unintentionally.
Yeah, you gave me too much credit, Peter.
May I ask Crook perhaps to say a few words? I mean, Crook is the co-founder, I guess, of an organization which has been working very much on corporate and social responsibility of companies, and so he founded IBLF Global, and basically invited me to join his workshop, talking basically on collective action. But I said, why don't you join mine and talk about my favorite subject, multi-stakeholder approaches. And so why don't you give an example on how you handle multi-stakeholder approaches in your work?
Thank you. Thank you very much, Peter. Thank you for having me on your panel.
Yeah.
So IBLF Global is an offshoot from what was the International Business Leaders Forum. This is one of the many charities of the Prince of Wales, who's now King of England. And but in those days, he brought together the leaders of the global multinationals who were investing in the developing world. And by the way, a lot of this took place as the Soviet Union was crumbling, and there were these new opportunities in Eastern Europe and in the former communist world to bring corporate responsibility to the markets. Anyway, in 2013, that organization closed down. I set up IBLF Global to focus on the anti-corruption agenda, which I felt was the must-have. And the multi-stakeholder approach is absolutely central to our work. But I have to say that we are not, I am not able to boast an institution like you've set up in EITI or in COST. And I suppose the reason for that is, while I share the three-sector approach, it's very difficult to do that countries where civil society is extremely weak and where government is very authoritarian and does not traditionally listen to either to the private sector or to civil society. So I've been working in better times in Russia, in China. These are very difficult markets now, of course. More recently, I've been working in Southeast Asia, and in particular in Vietnam. And in Vietnam, I have managed to bring the three sectors together. We did set up a government business integrity initiative in Vietnam, which has informed a lot of the anti-corruption work that has gone on between government and the private sector. I cannot still say that civil society in Vietnam is strong enough to be regularly at the table. The alternative is me, the IBLF Global, an international CSO, civil society organization, which brings the parties together and tries to build the capacity of government, of business, and the fledgling civil society to be able to engage in some kind of meaningful dialogue.
Well, thank you very much, Brooke. Then last in this first round is Gesine Schwan. She was a professor at the Freie Universität in Germany for many years, and then president of a big university in Frankfurt an der Oder, and a couple of times even the candidate for the presidency of Germany. So I was very pleased to see that she is doing in her work something which is practically the same which we are trying to do internationally, that is, bring together civil society, private sector, and government, mainly in communes in Europe. And therefore, I hope she can tell us a bit about that, and also give us later, when we go into more detail, a bit of sense of how one can, in a systematic way, look at our multi-stakeholder approach as a political scientist. So, Gesine Schwan, you are on the air.
Thank you very much for having invited me, and thank you already for having been able to listen to your various contributions. I'm not a typical civil society activist that has started only when I got in pension, when I was a pensioner, so rather late. But having had leader positions as, for instance, president of a university, but also in half political fields, the main challenge, also from the point of view of political science in a pluralist democracy, is how to bring about at least a fundamental consensus in order to bring forward politics which would not just preserve the state as it is, but which would really get into development and reforms, etc. And so the question of unity and diversity, as a very abstract question, but the question how to bring together various stakeholders with their not only different or variety of interests, but also contradictory interests, and also with a variety of power behind, because if they had just different interests, that would be a theoretical question, but it is not a theoretical, it's a practical question, as we can hear it here during the conference. There are some who are powerful and some who are less powerful, and that is very important. So, what we are trying now in this period of civil society activism is to strengthen democracy, and so we have a base of democracy in contrary to Vietnam, but we all know that our Western democracies are questioned, that we have everywhere strong movements of right-wing questioning political parties, and so what we try is to renew and to rebase democracy on the base of the municipality. This is a traditional approach because democracies, even on the state level, grew from community democracy. And we are trying out that with introducing into municipalities, with the consent and the support of the mayors and also of the municipality parliaments, we bring about municipality development councils in which the three stakeholders which have been mentioned now a number of times, namely representatives of legitimate power, mayor, administration, and on the other hand, the parliaments, but also representatives of civil society and the business sector, bring them together in order to debate about long-term development, not about day-to-day politics. This is a question of mayors and administration, but long-term developments. And as we are presently in a period of transformation, this is particularly important because if you want to be effective with that, you have really to have the support of people, of the society, and to bring this together and not just implementing it from above and then not working with it really. This is a mechanism which we have now introduced during the last 2 years within 10 towns and municipalities, also in East German towns where the situation is still a little different from West Germany. And it has become very successful because the way how to bring a consensus about, as Peter said, with the deliberative, you know what I mean, measure is that we introduce the various participants to and oblige them not only to say what they want and what they aim at and what is their interest, but to give reasons for that. And this level of reasons is then the level how to find consensus. I will stop it here because otherwise maybe it will be too long, but we can go on afterwards. Okay? Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. So here you have it. These are the representatives of a number of institutions. There are others even in the room which are applying this multi-stakeholder approach. And let's now try to go into some of the aspects of it. I mean, how do we decide who should be elected to come in? How will they be invited? Who will have the authority? Who's going to finance this process? What are the success stories? And in fact, maybe we should, in the first round, simply talk a little bit about these structural things in setting up these multi-stakeholder organizations, and then perhaps in a third round we go into the question of where are the success stories, where are the failures, what can we recommend to the world as bringing this into our toolkit of improving governance in many different sectors, in many different geographic situations. So I would like to have this round basically start on that basis. And maybe, Gay, it would be a good idea if you would tell us a little bit how this is structured at EITI. I mean, how do you select to bring a country in, a civil society organization in, a company in? How do you lose them if they don't want to play game anymore, as was happening with some of the American companies? So if you can give us just a few minutes of your experience in that field.
Thank you, Peter. So first of all, I want to say that ensuring that you have adequate and proper representation in the MSG, that's key, that's very important. Because if you don't get that right, you will run the risk of having reputational issues on the organization. If people are thinking, oh, this is a small group of people functioning like an echo chamber, talking to each other and colluding with one another, you want to avoid that, right? You want to preserve the credibility of the process and also of the multi-stakeholder group in order to make sure that you are really creating the impact that you want. So I started with that because that also speaks to the importance of having a good process for selecting members of the MSG. So in the EITI, the selection of MSG members, that is nationally driven. We recognize that each country has different contexts and different ways of selecting their members. However, at the minimum, the EITI standard has certain requirements. So I'm going to run through some of them. first of all, the selection process has to be open and transparent. And how this plays out in countries is that they usually, launch a call for nomination, especially for civil society. And it's a national process where they really cast the net very wide to make sure that every key stakeholder who is involved in the governance of the extractive sector is aware that a selection process is happening. So it has to be open and transparent. And it's the same for companies. They also make sure that the relevant associations, chambers of mines, petroleum associations in countries are all apprised and aware, and even non-chamber members are also aware that there's a selection process ongoing. On the part of the government, the selection process obviously is that whoever is in charge of overseeing or governing the sector, so it could be the Department of Mines, Department of Petroleum, but also because EITI is about fiscal transparency as well, usually the Treasury, Department of Finance, tax departments, they're also involved. And most importantly, local government units or subnational governments, because a lot of the mining projects are happening at the subnational level, so it's important to bring them to the table to get their perspective as well. It's also important, and this is also a minimum requirement, that MSG members are able to freely operate independently, meaning to say if you're part of a civil society organization, you are an independent and genuine civil society organization. You're not captured by the government or by any company. So I won't elaborate on that. I think that's self-explanatory. But also, it's also important that there's gender balance within the multi-stakeholder group. So this gender balance, this is something that has been introduced, I think, 6 years ago in the EITI, where it's now a requirement that when selecting MSG members, they need to make sure that they work towards gender parity, obviously to accommodate more diverse views. And then the other requirement is that there has to be a rotation among the members. Of course, we know if a group will always benefit from fresh insights. Again, going back to what I was saying earlier about preventing this group to perform as an echo chamber, there always has to be a system of checks and balances. So to avoid the risk of the same set of people talking the same issues and probably not accommodating diverging views anymore, there has to be, rules need to be in place, and this need to be codified in the terms of reference of the multi-stakeholder groups to make sure that they rotate amongst themselves. EITI is not very prescriptive about this. Countries have the authority to decide the tenure, how long the members should be there. But what we have seen on the average, 3 to 4 years is the number of years that MSG members serve in that group. But also, they need to obviously preserve institutional memory. So every time there's a rotation, we need to make sure that someone else is left behind to make sure there's continuity also in the policies that the group is pushing for.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, this is we will come later to some of the problems which we had at EITI when some members wanted to leave because they were not content with what they consider to be sort of a biased approach of the chairman of the board, which was myself, and the Americans threatened to get out because they didn't want to disclose certain things in their countries and so on. But we come back to that later. Maybe I can ask you, Huguette, to tell us a bit about the integrity pacts, which has been developed at Transparency International, which is, in my opinion, a very good example of multi-stakeholder approaches.
Yeah, thank you, Peter. And this, of course, deals with procurement primarily. The World Bank estimates that about 10 to 30% of the cost of capital investment projects is consumed by corruption. And of course, we could go over the long list of what this this causes after. But and of course, what we know is that corruption can happen at any stage of the process, of a procurement process, not just at the time of the bidding, but before and even after. So this is why the integrity pacts have been so important. And they've, as a tool, developed by TI to help governments, business sector, and civil society, really, to fight corruption in public contracting. How it works is that, well, it's been around since the 90s. It is a signed document which is approved as an approach to contracting, and it commits contracting authorities, bidders, to comply with the best practices and maximum transparency. A third sector, usually a civil society organization, I know that TI chapters have been involved in doing this, monitors the process and the commitments that have been made. The monitor commits to maximum transparency, and all monitoring reports and results are made available to the public on an ongoing basis. And it is updated on a regular basis as situations evolve in terms of the exact process that is made. Right now, there are 28 countries that use integrity pacts around the world, and they really are around the world. But actually, 18 of these 28 are in Europe, which is also very important. I'd like to just give a few examples, Peter, to demonstrate what I'm talking about here. Use Honduras as one. In 2013, the Transparency International's Honduran chapter exposed massive corruption in the purchase, sales, and distribution of medicine in the country to state hospitals. It endangered, of course, the lives of untold number of Hondurans, and it created twice the cost of buying medicine that it would otherwise have costed without this corruption aspect. So basically, in terms of results, an integrity pact was signed with the Minister of Health in this case, and with major pharmaceutical companies to monitor the purchase and supply of medicine in the country. And this came into effect after long discussions in 2017 with a very great, I think, change in the availability of medicine. My only other example that I would use is the European Union. In 2016, Transparency International, with 11 national chapters in the EU, and along with other local society organizations, embarked on a process to update the clean contracting approach. It includes projects such as flood protection, road building, tram, construction of various big institutions, power supply, and so on. And the EU estimates that corruption in public procurement could be costing 5 billion each year, because these are major projects that are multi-billion projects each. So the Integrity Pact was signed, was a signed commitment between the public authorities of these countries and companies bidding for contract, and along with civil society organization. And of course, the impacted result, greater confidence among the public, among governments, among the private sector, that funds are spent for the purpose intended, and they are. So it means a lot of savings and therefore more of these projects being built. I will not go into the Mexican case as the last one, but it's one that if we have time, we can go back, because this is one of the oldest integrity pact. It started back in 2002 and has been a tremendous asset in that country. Of course, a certain amount is identified and agreed to in terms of the size of projects, because you can't do every 10,000 mini project. So there is a level, but that's adopted and agreed to between all the entities in the country. So integrity pacts, I think, is something that hopefully will be developed much further in more countries and will save tremendous amounts of money for the taxpayers, but also make sure that services are provided at a very different level than they would otherwise be.
Well, thank you very much, Huguette. I mean, maybe an interesting story to many of you may be that Mr. McNamara, who the former president of the World Bank, he supported me when we tried to start Transparency International, and he came to Berlin to the founding in 1993. And said to me, I like very much what we didn't call Integrity Pact at the time, we called it Island of Integrity, which basically was an attempt to say to big companies, you don't have to stop bribing all over the world all at once, but we will organize integrity pacts for particular competitive situations, and we will ask everybody who is bidding to sign a contract to stop bribing immediately and to introduce controls which would be carried out by civil society organizations. So it was a sort of triangular relationship. And McNamara said to me, Peter, if you manage to do that, I give you $10,000. Of course, not me personally, but he would give it to Transparency International. And in fact, that's exactly what we did that. And it became one of our main tools. I talked yesterday to somebody from Pakistan who said this is even mandatory in certain sectors right now in Pakistan. So it has become a really powerful tool and leads me basically to you, Craig, because you are dealing with procurement also. And maybe you could also have an example for us. I mean, we have to be a bit conscious of time, but I would love to hear what you are doing. Gesine and I, by the way, in the interest of transparency, I should say that Gesine Schwan is my wife. We were in Ethiopia and visited the Office of Cost, and we saw the traffic program which had been handed to the Chinese, and it didn't really look like one which had been under the rules of cost in Addis. So let us have one of your examples.
Well, it's fine. If you want to go into examples, I mean, I just had a few words about how, because it's frequently a question we get as to how people are organizing themselves in country to form these chapters, or whatever you want to call them, the membership. And it's interesting that this is a process which it obviously starts with a request to the Secretariat of Cost for the startup of a cost program, but then goes through a large number of, well, not, but a significant number of steps in order to make sure that the infrastructure that you're talking about this multi-stakeholder approach, is well entrenched, which we all know, given political realities, is not always the easiest to do. There's a great amount of freedom that is being given to the countries or the subnational entities that apply in terms of how they want to do it, but there are certain established conditions in the sense of making sure that some of the main elements of cost are being adhered to. Obviously, the whole way in which data is being made available and in what form, but very particularly also the multi-stakeholder group and how it's supposed to function and how it should be a true reflection of the cooperation between the three stakeholder groups that we've been talking about. And this can be a relatively long process. We're helping in this by doing so-called scoping studies and some assessments beforehand to help out where the problems lie. There is something to be done about the stakeholder identification. In other words, it's a very complete process. And we have learned, as I'm sure you have learned in EITI, is that this upfront work is particularly important in order to have the clear foundations for this process to take place.
But let me ask you in this context, I mean, do you have a system of principles which have to be agreed before you adopt certain members to participate?
Correct.
In EITI, of course, this was a lot of work to get these principles together.
Correct.
And therefore you have this possibility of declaring your members as compliant, which is a price, you know, which helps you to attract investments and so on in Africa. But do you have something like that at cost?
We do. I think we've looked at EITI, and I think EITI is a framework also with the extractive industries, which is a little easier because it deals with one particular sector and one particular set of issues. But yes, we do have requirements up front. We've kept them relatively moderate in order to leave a lot to the local design capabilities. But yes, there are, and there have been already in our history, which is now about 10, 15 years, countries that have been only temporarily members of COST, where it turned out very quickly that it wasn't working and developing the way we wanted, and more particularly the authorities wanted it. We've had processes where we started a membership application, or was started, and we found out in collaboration with the governments or the entities that this was perhaps not the right moment and the right time to go ahead with this kind of an arrangement. And I think that is part of the strong, is a strong point that we have, which is that there is this collaboration with the authorities that are applying. But there's also an understanding that if some of these minimum conditions, and I use the word conditions not as being the old form as sort of conditionality, but some of these requirements to guarantee a longer term success are not in place. And that is important. After all, there's also reputational risk. COST, as it has developed now over the years, stands for something. And it's being seen by people as not as a stamp of approval, but at least it is seen by people as a commitment on the part of the authorities to work towards greater transparency and accountability in public investment. And if there is not a feeling that these particular conditions are being met, it is also important for COST. We run a risk there, and that is one that we need to keep into account, take into account as we move forward. But in terms of examples, we can come to that later maybe, but there have been some very interesting examples in terms of policy reforms that were triggered by COST, major cost savings, time savings of projects, better design, quality. All this is well documented, and like all these initiatives, we have and continue to improve on our monitoring and evaluation system, because that's obviously critically important, not for the countries themselves, but also for others if they want to join this kind of an initiative.
Thank you. Brooke, do you have in your work, perhaps in Vietnam and so on, do you have any special examples where this issue of who can join a multi-stakeholder group, what would be the authority at the end of passing on their consensus basically to the government, the decision makers and so on? Do you have something like that from your work?
Yeah, I would prefer to move on to the next section, really, because as I said before, I haven't institutionalized
so then I ask
the work.
Gesine whether you have an example, or do you want to say something in spite of that at this section?
No, I'd like to go on to the next section.
Yeah, okay.
For the interest
Gesine,
of
can
time.
you say a little bit about your work?
I mean, maybe 3 points of view. First, to constitute these municipality multi-stakeholder advisory councils, you need, first of all, the support of the mayor and of parliament of a municipality. Otherwise, it doesn't work. But we don't want that what is then constituted is just the outcome of the decision-making of the mayor and the head of parliament. But we want to have a certain civil society initiative in it, and therefore we create a multi-stakeholder small group, starting group, about 6-7 persons who stem from the municipality and who then, by cooptation, first of all say what would be the organizations, the group with the 3 main stakeholders, government, civil society, and private sector or business. And then within them, who are the main and most important personalities? This is on the municipality level. That means it is a level which you can overview and where you have a certain knowledge. This is to start so that they would be independent from the mayor and also from the parliament, but then they constitute the issue of development and also the composition of the advisory council, but it goes back to the municipality parliament, and then this parliament decides about the issue, about the subject, the challenge, and also about the composition. So, and this goes then to this advisory council. The advisory council is having deliberation on that 4 times a day, for days, and then it goes back to parliament, because in that way they are bond together, that it is not just separate from the parliamentary decision-making process, but that they go together. I just wanted to add a second point, namely, what I'm listening to is very often the point of transparency. And this is, of course, with Transparency International, not surprising. And I think it is not just the will or the political culture of transparency, but it is a constitutional outcome. Because if you organize to bring a variety of stakeholders and interests together, and that these interests are contradictory to each other, then you get to the old liberal principle of conflict, and conflict unveils what is hidden behind other political decision-making. So this is also on this political level of municipality a way in order to really unveil the interests and then have a decision-making what would really contribute to the municipality, instead of having the various lobbies getting to the mayor and getting to the administration and getting to parliament, and nobody knows who has done what. And therefore, this transparency aspect binds them together. I stop it here.
Well, thank you very much. Well, let's move on. I mean, let me just bring an example of failures. You know, for instance, the Integrity Pact. We were asked by some big companies in Germany to introduce an Integrity Pact when the airport in Berlin was built. They came to my office, the big contractors, and said, please, let's organize an Integrity Pact. And the owners of the airport, the federal government, the government of Brandenburg, the government of Berlin, they couldn't agree. They said, no, we are not a banana republic. We don't need this stuff. And so only from Berlin they wanted to have an Integrity Pact. So we couldn't do it. And that was in 1998. And in 2002, the whole Berlin airport had to be rebid because there was so much corruption that the whole thing had to be started all over. And at that time, we were asked to have an Integrity Pact. And we did, and we lost about 4 years of construction time for this big airport. And I have other stories like that. In EITI, we have the stories, you know, where the Americans didn't want to live up to the requirements of the SEC, which tried to implement the requirements of EITI, and other stories like that. So if we can talk a bit about the failures, but also the successes of this approach, and I think that's why you wanted to talk about, Brooke.
Yeah, thank you. So I think the Vietnam example was really interesting because in 2015, when I started working there, the whole thing was at ground zero. There was no dialogue between government and business and civil society. There was really the whole anti-corruption agenda was absent. It just wasn't there. And you know, one little step led to another. It led to legal reform. A new anti-corruption law was eventually brought in. I remember the first time I brought together the government and small and medium-sized enterprises. I mean, it was an explosive meeting. They'd never seen each other face-to-face before. And you know, I know that that's not the same as having an institutionalized organization like COST and EITI. But, you know, either we have to accept that that approach is not possible in 80% of the world's economies, or we start preparing the ground for it. And really, that's the rather tricky work that I've been doing in these countries like Vietnam. So, there are plenty of failures I can talk about. I can talk about when we've got very close to institutionalizing a multi-stakeholder approach, and then the government has said, oh, we're going to have an anti-corruption clampdown. We're going to have a campaign against corruption. And guess what? All the parties go off in different directions. We've seen that repeatedly. So, if it's an unstable regime, or if we're getting too close to talking about what really needs to be talked about, the government can pull away. So I'll leave it at that for the moment.
Well, thank you. I mean, I guess we are, the time is running away with us, and maybe I come back to our group here at the end after we heard some of the questions and comments from our audience. This is okay?
Yes.
So please let me invite you who want to say something, want to ask something. Some of you may want to say whom they want to ask this from. Some of them may want to simply put out the question. And why don't we start with you with the microphone? Thank you.
Great. Good morning. My name is Matt Aubrey. I'm the executive director for the Organization for Responsible Governance in the Bahamas. And for the entire panel, a lot of what you're saying is really resonating with us. I think we fall on this side of the spectrum, though. We have a very strong government, not a very strong civil society, and a private sector that is smaller in than what its potential might be able to be in influencing policy. So I guess my question then becomes, you've referenced how do you do work on the ground? We do a lot of work in citizen engagement and policy development and civil society capacity building. And then what are some of the benchmarks that you start to see that indicate this is time for expansion, this is time for further development? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And there was somebody there also, right where, please.
Thank you very much, Michel Rowland from Ecuador. I have a very specific question to Mr. Portman about the FiTI model. I come from Quito. Quito was just beginning to operate the subway, which cost $2,000 million, and there was alleged accusation of corruption linked with the consortium that built the subway. It was a consortium composed by Odebrecht and Acciona. So the World Bank, the Corporación Andina de Fomento, and the Inter-American Development Bank suggested to apply the FiTI model to avoid corruption. And well, after the building of the system, we can check that was a big case of corruption there. So the organism suggested to put in practice the FiTI model just to avoid corruption, and they renounced to the national procurement system to be applied there. So what's your opinion about the FiTI model that was put in practice because of the advice of the organization, international organization? Thank you very much.
So let's take one more question, maybe here in front. And then we take another 3 questions afterwards.
My question is very...
Can you introduce yourself?
Okay, yeah. Juliana Breno, I am the Regional Compliance Officer for Schneider Electric based in Stockholm, Nordic and Baltic region. But before I was in South America, so I know very much the situation in Quito and things like that. So good. And also Odebrecht is a very known company in Brazil by corruption. So, but my question is more... Yeah, Odebrecht, yes. So... my question is more practical. So regarding the integrity package, could you give me some examples of what is the content of these integrity packs, and how do we ensure the effective implementation and monitoring of these packs? Because to me it seems very nice, but it's not tangible, and whether we have some kind of incentives for those who comply, or sanctions, if applicable, for those who does not comply.
Thank you very much. So why don't we take these 3 questions? The first one on the Bahamas was relatively broad, and maybe I don't know who wants to respond to that. You?
Yep.
Go ahead, Brooke.
Thank you for your question. You were asking about what are the sort of signposts that you could tell that you can elevate the activity from just a dialogue to actual multi-stakeholder approach. And well, I think it's going to depend from country to country, and it's also the time is going to be completely varied. And as I said, things can go backwards as well as forwards. But I felt that, for me, in the absence of strong civil society, at least get the private sector on board, and not. The global multinationals who are investing in the country are critical. If you can't get them involved, how are you going to get the big national companies involved and the state-owned enterprises? So that's the first step. Secondly, you've got to get the business associations involved as well. Very often they just treat this as a sort of something that they don't really want to do at all. So I think that is a very important first step. Then civil society, well, I think that, unfortunately, it is a question of building it. And here, the local allies, this is what I'm working with COST at the moment, by the way, on a project in Thailand and Indonesia. And this is where COST has had a remarkable effect in building local groups, working with Transparency International locally or Global Witness. This is very powerful, but they need to have the opportunity to learn from the experience of other countries. So, and the final point I would make is, if it doesn't work at the national level, by all means, come down to the municipal level. And that's where you can get real people addressing real issues that affect them. It's no longer an academic exercise. And that's why I think this, your example in Germany is actually very powerful for the developing world as well.
Thank you. I guess, Crick, one question was addressed to you.
Yeah. The FiTI model. I must confess that I'm not totally up to snuff with what the FiTI model is, although we have FiTI actually as a representative of the private sector on our board. So they actually have a significant input, and we learn from them and they learn from us. But the point I'm trying to make is that I'm sure the FiTI model has particular safeguards built in to deal with the issues of corruption. And the FiTI model, I would expect, is one that looks particularly at the procurement process. And different from COST is clearly, COST is not a procurement agency. COST is not a control mechanism. It's a mechanism by which the three parties are being joined in the table to actually raise issues and raise them to the attention of the policymakers so that they can take action. That's a major issue right there, and we'll come to that, I think, when we come to the conclusion of this discussion. But I'm sure that FiTI has these kind of provisions in their contract, and I would guess that they have a tremendous reach, being a worldwide association, and I'm sure they can provide significant input into this process. Mm-hmm. But moving that to a COST type of approach is quite different. COST is clearly an establishment of an institution, whereas the IP process has significant advantages as they relate to one particular project. COST is obviously not just focused on one project. So I think there are a number of choices that they can make, but I would expect that the FiTI model can at least deal with the issues that you raise.
Well, on this third question on how the Integrity Pact works, I have to restrain myself because it was sort of one of my babies for a long time. And basically, I'm a lawyer. It was a legal agreement between all participants in a competitive bidding to stop bribing immediately. And this was a contractual paper, and which was entered into to overcome the moral hazard of one of them behaving more ethically than the others and suffering for it. And therefore, everybody had to stop at the same time, and then bring in a monitor, which was civil society, to see what is happening. So this was done in many, many countries, and it's now introduced in many countries in the beginning against the wishes of the World Bank, because they thought this was interfering with free competitive bidding. I mean, I had been one of the drafters of the procurement guidelines of the World Bank when I was in the legal department of the World Bank. So I knew that we touched construction with a barge pole, because we didn't want to get too closer to it at the time. But then, of course, later it became a very established instrument, and I really want Huguette to respond to this, because she was running.
Just very quickly, so that we can have a second round of questions. But to have an agreement which is well publicized, right from day one, so that the public is aware. To me, that is one big thing. The second one is, as I mentioned earlier, the reporting, the monitor reporting on an ongoing basis publicly what the result of their monitoring is. And to me, the third one is to make sure that you keep the business sector involved, because you will have those who were benefiting before, who were getting the contracts, who became bigger and bigger, and therefore more able to bribe. And so that to make sure that it's not just also the large companies, but a large number of companies that are kept in the picture, where the monitoring reports are sent to them directly, not just made public, but do that. To me, when these sorts of things, starting with an agreement, as Peter said, which is legal, which is binding, and which is very public. And I think the monitor, it's important for the organizations that help to press for this, for integrity pacts, that they too, remain very involved in publicizing, in promoting the importance of these, so that you do have the schools being built and the hospitals and the medicines, and that the big contract in terms of public sector major infrastructure, where you don't have the wear and tear so fast after it's built because of mediocre equipment and material, that you have to start building again. So I think these are some of the ideas, but maybe there are more people in the room who can add to the question, because it's an important one.
So can we have one very quick next round? You have been your hand up in the beginning.
Yes, and somebody over there.
And then you at the end.
Yes.
So 3 more, and then because we have to close in 10 minutes.
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Stephen Brager with USAID Guatemala. And I know I have a basic question, which is, who pays for these multi-stakeholder not agreements, but the groups? In particular, whether it's the integrity pacts or otherwise, because, I know that USAID has funded these in the past, but I'm thinking of how to do it in a sustainable manner, right? We can't continue to pay for civil society to participate. And they're the ones who bear the greatest cost, because they're the ones who are really doing the work, they're doing the reporting, et cetera, et cetera. There are costs to the government because they have to change procedures, maybe some cost to
Can you speak a little bit more in the microphone, please?
Sorry, maybe some cost to the government, to the companies, because they have to change some procedures and maybe regulations within, but the major cost is to civil society. And so how do you pay for it in a sustainable manner? Thanks.
Good question. No, there was one lady there.
Yeah.
On that side. Sorry.
Thank you. My name is Ana Luisa Aranha. I work for the United Nations Global Compact. My question is, what's the role of the United Nations, and specifically, what's the role of United Nations Global Compact in these multi-stakeholder approaches?
I think there was a third one.
Was there a third question? Yeah, right here.
The lady in the middle. There. Okay. All right.
Hi. Thank you. My name is Zugi Swakota from civil society in South Africa. My question is a little bit related to the resourcing one, and it was just This work obviously entails quite a bit of energy in terms of individuals, and I imagine as well in terms of champions. How have you found ways to sustain that work once the champions leave or once the pioneers leave? I imagine that's not easy, but in terms of institutionalizing those with or without the sort of financial resourcing.
Well, thank you. Who wants to address this first question about was it about the funding and so on in Guatemala? Is this right?
Well, not necessarily in Guatemala, but
You want to say something about that?
Well, yeah, I mean, it's a great question. And continuously a problem for any of us trying to set these things up. But clearly, once you have a multi-stakeholder arrangement like that, then you've got to have multiple sources of funding. And civil society has not got its own money, so it's got to either come from the government or from the companies. Now, my organization used to be funded by multinational companies in the old days of the pre-IBLF Global. So, we were able to do all of these things, core funding from global multinationals. That's great, but those days have long gone. And it is a problem. It's inconceivable that a program like these ones should be funded by USAID or State Department or the UK government. The funding lasts for a year, 3 years, 5 years, and then it's gone and the whole thing disappears. So if it doesn't get the funding from the companies and the governments that are at the heart of this, it's not going to work. I did have... Okay.
May I cut you off here? Because
I've got a
obviously you have
never
been fundraising for civil society. I mean, I've been doing this for 30 years right now, and we take money from everybody. But it's extremely difficult to do it, and you have to do it in a way that you don't lose your objectivity, your credibility, your legitimacy. And in the United States, NGOs don't take money from governments because they think they lose their independence and so on. In Europe, people are very reluctant to take money from companies, and therefore we have to create a structure, and that's what we did in Transparency International by having an advisory council and now an international council which reestablishes the credibility even if you take money from various sources. So we took money from Siemens, for instance. They were corporate members. And I was criticized for that, but we took the money, but we said, you have to live up to certain standards. And if you don't, you are going to take a big risk. And Siemens took that risk and fell into a big hole at the time. I had a tremendous discussion with George Soros, because he said, look, I'm funding everything you want to do in Eastern Europe. But then you have to do more or less what I want. And I said, no. I mean, this is, we don't take your money if this is your condition. And he accepted that. And he accepted our structure at TI. I know. It's an extremely important issue, the question of funding and how you keep your legitimacy. And it's an interesting vision which Brooke has. But I mean, there are others who have a lot of experience in fundraising for civil society. A quick response from you.
Well, I'm not sure how to respond to the question about the United Nations, but the issue that was raised by the lady from South Africa, I think, goes to the heart of what I think is the future, might be the future. I mean, this question of institutionalization is one that is critically important. I mean, these groups come together in a certain political environment that is conducive to that kind of development, and politics can change. I mean, we've seen countries where they were very progressive, making very good progress in bringing greater transparency and accountability. There was a change of government and these institutions disappeared. Funding was an important issue, but not that important. Right. Cost is not a very expensive exercise, and there is a certain amount of money that we can provide for the poorer countries in order to keep the program going.
One quick word.
The question is really one of the legal basis of the program. we have a number of different options. I mean, you can have a simple fiscal agency where somebody else which provides you with a legal basis to operate on, but it's not much. Then you have cost being part of a host organization, which is a ministry of a department. And then you have a non-profit legal entity status. And it's the third one that is the only one that really isolates you from potential changes as you move along. But that is the most difficult one to get. We've only got a few countries that have able to establish themselves as an independent legal agency. But your point about this, and there are, and we didn't get time for that, but if you look at the multi-stakeholder approach, there are some real risks there in terms of, you know, the voluntary nature of the people who do it, how long can they do this, the lack of continuity, the monitoring and evaluation, the lack of a government response. I mean, there are a lot of potential problems down the road, and I think they all go to the heart of that sustainability question that you're talking about.
Exactly, right. One word from you.
Yes. In terms of the UN, I think this is a very, very key question as well, and it relates to some of the other international organizations as well of the same nature. For example, the UNODC, UN Office of Drugs and Crimes, you know, has been very close to the corruption issue and working very closely with Transparency International and many other organizations in conducting their own work. But in terms of the UN generally, I think that when we're talking about integrity pacts or multi-stakeholder, other kinds of multi-stakeholder approaches, it is to the advantage of the UN's delivery of its own programs, because you've got staff on the ground everywhere. And extortion is part of what we're talking about. And therefore, you know, the UN can be, without promoting one single approach, but encouraging countries to look at how they can really reduce corruption in their country and save money, and save the UN's money for the purpose it was intended for. So I think that, to me, these are some of the things that, so that for the UN to become well-informed, you know, the staff on the ground become well-informed about these programs, and to provide support when it's appropriate for the UN to do so. In terms of sustainability, I would just like to say that, just to add up to your point, Craig, that the financing of these support, I think, is usually integrity pacts part of the agreement. And therefore, that's helpful. Okay, but secondly, I think that we're dealing with small amounts, as you were talking about. When you compare to the billions and billions that are lost with corruption, you're talking about a very minimal amount of financial support to do the monitoring and the promotion, if that is part of the agreement as well.
Thank you very much. I guess your question was also directed directly about a UN Global Compact, and we love it. I was there when Kofi Annan announced it in 1999 in Davos. I was at least 10 times in New York when it was established. But it is an organization basically establishing a relationship between companies and governments. It doesn't bring in civil society with the same meaning and importance as what we are looking for. But I think it is a very close relative to what we call the multi-stakeholder approach. But we are looking forward to the next session at the plenary, which will be bringing together the speakers for the UN Global Compact and so on. It fits very well together, and I'm very happy that the UN Global Compact included the 10th principle, which some people call the Peter principle, because there was one particular guy who was called Peter, and he pushed Kofi Annan to make sure that in addition to the 9 principles which had been the Global Compact, the 10th principle was included, and that is on corruption. So I think we are very close to them. We have very little time left. We have perhaps 1 minute left or 2.
16 seconds.
I'm sorry? But your question was also addressed, right? Yes. Yeah. So do you think I meet the sense of the meeting if it is recognized that this multi-stakeholder process can be an important mechanism to create a consensus between different relevant interests in society? Yeah. I mean, that we are seeking different interests who are openly discussing their interests and their perspectives and their needs in a respectful and open way, and then come to a compromise which will be fed into the democratic governance structure in a country, the government structure of the representatives, the ministers, and the parliaments, and the executive branch, and so on. They have to take the decisions. But the recommendations will come from this multi-stakeholder process, which will then underpin the decisions which will be taken, so that the decisions are not simply on paper, but that they become reality. Become reality in order to deal with corruption, in order to deal with the needs of society, support the poor, support the weak, and to avoid conflict in society, and this way allow everybody to play a more effective and more beneficial role. Does that sort of meet the sense of this meeting, or is this a bit too imperial when I put it this way?
You want to have a vote on it? You want to vote?
No. No vote. Just consensus.
Just consensus. There you go.
Yeah. Is this how we can include this and hopefully make it a recommendation also in the plenary sessions and so on? I will be speaking in the next plenary and will sort of report this basically to the big hall of this wonderful conference, which hopefully will make quite a difference in global governance worldwide. And there are so many things we can continue to discuss. And please come to us, up to the panelists, and we will be very pleased to continue on a bilateral basis with you, in particular on countries like Ecuador. This was one of my favorite countries when I was division chief at the World Bank, or in Panama, where there are fantastic things going on at right now, or with you, Drago, who played such an important role in the OECD convention to make it live and so on. So all of you, I thank you very, very much for having shared this session with us here. Thank you very much.